Hello and welcome to Subject to Change with me, Russell Hogg. My guest today is award-winning historian Hampton Sides. Hampton's books include In the Kingdom of Ice about the polar expedition of the Jeannette, and that was a personal favourite of mine. There was also Blood and Thunder about Kit Carson and the American West, which again was an absolutely terrific read. And today we're going to be talking about his book On Desperate Ground, which tells the story of the US Marines at war in Korea in the winter of 1950. It's an absolutely gripping story and I can't recommend it enough. Anyway, welcome Hampton to the podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
As I say, your book focuses on a particular slice of the Korean War, and you start with the landing of the Marines at Incheon, and then the capture of Seoul and the push north towards the Yalu River and the Chinese border. And the core of your book is this massive clash between the Marines and the Chinese at the Chosin Reservoir. So I thought, if you think, what I might do is sort of give the listeners, I'll start by giving the listeners a bit of context and give a very short summary of how the Korean War got started, and then I'll hand it over to you, if that sounds okay.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay, so I thought it probably needs to go back to World War II and then maybe even a bit before that, because Korea for about 35 years before World War II had been run, and run pretty brutally, I think, by the Japanese as one of their colonies. And then after World War II is over, the Americans arrive to take over from the Japanese, and they arrive in the south. And the Russians have, quite late in the day joined the war in this vicinity, and they've invaded from the north. So you've got the Russians in the north of Korea down to the 38th parallel. That's their zone of influence, a bit like in World War, a bit like in East and West Germany, and the Americans are in the south, so they've got their zone of influence. And by 1948, the Soviets withdraw, or I think by then they've withdrawn from North Korea, but they've left behind a ruthless and actually pretty effective regime under the dictator Kim Il-sung. And from what I read, I did a bit of reading, and from what I could see, the communists actually seem pretty effective and certainly extremely well organized. And the Americans in the South, they're backing an anti-communist Syngman Rhee, and he's a pretty authoritarian guy. And my sense was that his government was pretty corrupt, and at that time at least pretty unpopular, and that generally the forces in the South are weaker and more divided. And neither government, either in the South or the North, really accept the border, and they both want the country reunified, and of course reunified on their terms, because neither accepts the legitimacy of the other. So in June 1950, the North Korean forces pour over the border in an all-out invasion. The US rushes its forces to Korea to try and shore up the regime. And these initial months go really, really badly for the South Koreans and for the Americans as they're pushed further and further south. And I think everyone will be glad to know that my introduction has sort of come to an end now, because I think I've sort of taken up to the point where you can maybe take over.
Well, it is really a revealing thing to try to figure out just what you've just now done, to figure out where does the Korean War really begin, because it is so complicated and it really has its roots in World War II and even before. So thank you for that preamble, which was very succinct. There's so many strands and complexities to this, because you have this little finger of land, the Korean Peninsula, that has been fought over for millennia by different cultures and by different empires. It's sort of been the whipping boy, the redheaded stepchild of world history for so long. And then, of course, the Chinese had kind of always viewed it as a stepping stone to Japan, and the Japanese had used it as a stepping stone to China. So your introduction kind of brings us to the moment when, at the end of World War II, the world powers, the winners, the victors, were trying to figure out how to divide up the spoils of the Japanese empire. And one of the spoils was this place called Korea that most Americans had never heard of Korea. They didn't know what it was. It was seemed to be part of Manchuria or part of China. And because the United States won the war and was running the occupation of Japan in the person of General Douglas MacArthur, the very, very famous and very vainglorious general who was running that occupation, we were at least technically committed to the defense of South Korea, just as the Soviet Union had decided it would be in charge of the fate and fortune of North Korea. And when Kim Il-sung invaded South Korea, hoping to unite this whole peninsula, and this is a really important part of the story that I think most people don't realize, is that line across the peninsula, 38th parallel, was a completely artificial line. It didn't really have any historical meaning. There's really very little difference, or at least there was then, between North Korea and South Korea. Same language, same culture, same society, same civilization. And it really is a testament to, it was one of the great geopolitical tragedies that line ever got drawn in the first place. But it was just an arbitrary line, a convenient line that happened to kind of go right across the waist of the middle of the Korean Peninsula, just as lines were drawn around Berlin, at the end of World War II to signify these zones of influence. So we get to the point where Kim Il-sung, using Soviet tanks, Soviet artillery, and Soviet trained troops, crosses that artificial line, that 38th parallel, and invades Seoul, very quickly runs over Seoul and pushes those forces down to the very tip of the peninsula, the Pusan perimeter, as it's called. And Douglas MacArthur, who really had not been paying very close attention to all of this, realized that this was, these forces were in danger of being completely overrun. And he was committed to protecting South Korea in some way. So he decided to send his forces sort of behind enemy lines, not even really to focus so much on the Pusan perimeter, but rather go all the way back up to Seoul and invade at the port of Incheon, which serves Seoul. And it was one of the great amphibious landings of all time. I mean, it was almost on the scale of Normandy. It was hugely successful. The North Koreans didn't really think he would go in there. And you have this very vain and very arrogant general who believes he can do no wrong. And then here he does pull off this amazingly successful amphibious landing that brings in all these troops.
And in your book, I sort of got a hint in your book, and maybe it's more than a hint, that you think that the risks he runs in that are, well, it's a huge success, as you say, so we don't think about what could have gone wrong. But a lot could have gone wrong, couldn't it?
It was, I think there was a huge element of luck that it went off as well as it did. One of the problems of Incheon was that it had one of the world's greatest tidal differentials between low tide and high tide. And if they didn't time it just exactly right, they would have been stranded out there on these mud flats, and they would have been sitting ducks for the North Korean troops that were stationed there. Luckily, they timed it right, and they got ashore just before the tides came out. So that was one factor. There were plenty of other places that had been identified as just as fortuitous places to land, but this was MacArthur's idea, and you could not question him. He at this point was at the height of his power. He had surrounded himself with his own intelligence officers and yes men. He ran this war basically from Tokyo. He almost never came to Korea. A lot of the advisors back in Washington said, this is insanely risky. This is this is hubris. This is almost the very definition of hubris. But because he pulled it off, this contributed even more to this sense of MacArthur's inevitability. He was always right. You could never question him. Don't also forget that he also had political ambitions and there was much thought that he would be running for president of the United States back in, at the next election cycle as a Republican. I don't think there's ever been a time in American history, at least, when so much power and so much authority has been concentrated in one man as Douglas MacArthur during the Korean War, because he was running, he was essentially the emperor of Japan. He was the head of the U.S. Army in the Far East. He was the head of the UN forces in Korea. And he was this sort of political figure. He's also, I think, you've read the book, he's not someone that I, in the course of the story, warm up to very much, because he also just happened to be this very old school, very arrogant, histrionic. Just his command style was so old school. It was like Napoleonic or something. And it doesn't really age well in our modern society when we read about people like him. I think, among American generals, I think we've come to really admire people like Eisenhower, who was collaborative and modest and, really a decent guy. Whereas MacArthur, it was always about him. They used to say he was in love with the vertical pronoun. I shall return, and here I, it's all about him and his posture, and he was super attentive to every little micro nuance of media and how he was being presented in the world. And when the cameras were on and the microphones were on, he sort of became this different person. So, but he is a fascinating character and someone who I think has been pretty thoroughly reassessed since World War II. He was, I think, viewed as God almost during the war. And now I think most historians have, like myself, have come in, and become quite critical of him. Although he had these moments, these flashes of brilliance, and Incheon was one of them. It was a huge success, and not necessarily because of anything he did. It was also a success because it was run by some really professional people, including and especially the 1st Marine Division, which really did, along with the Navy, plan this whole operation, not MacArthur.
Did you say that MacArthur is sort of the big I, the big personal pronoun?
Yeah.
But actually, probably in your story, the two key commanders, it's less MacArthur and it's more this guy Almond and this guy Smith.
Right.
So what are their roles in the invasion?
Well, General Oliver Smith was the commander of the First Marine Division, which was arguably, almost certainly, the most elite fighting force that the United States had, and they were the ones that came in during Incheon and pushed their way into Seoul, surrounded Seoul, and liberated the city of Seoul from the North Korean invaders very quickly. General Smith was someone who had really trained in some of the worst and most ferocious battles of World War II, like Peleliu and Okinawa. And he was highly respected, very cautious, very modest, someone who was truly an expert in the sense that he had practically written a book on amphibious warfare. This is what Marines are really supposed to be good at. It's like coming from the ships ashore, storming the beaches. So it made sense that they chose the 1st Marine Division to kind of spearhead this amphibious landing at Incheon. Smith was not your typical Marine, though. Even though he was a career Marine, he was, I think many people associate the Marines with, being sort of super macho and gung-ho and attack. In fact, he was known as the Professor. He was very intellectual. He was constantly reading. He would read during the heat of battle. He read the classics. He was a graduate of Berkeley in California, and he was always smoking a pipe. He was fluent in French. He had traveled all over the world. He was a very cosmopolitan guy, and so in that sense, not your typical Marine. In the story, I do try to contrast General Smith and his commanding style with the other commander that you mentioned, General Ned Almond, who was the general on the ground in Korea that MacArthur sent to Korea. I think I mentioned earlier, MacArthur almost never left his headquarters in Tokyo. I think it's said that he never slept one single night on Korean soil during the entire war.
I was trying to make sense of that. I was thinking, well, maybe he shouldn't. Maybe Japan is not very far away. Maybe he's got his base all set up. What more can he see if he's actually on the move?
Well, I mean, I think that when the war turned, dark and things were not going well, it probably would have been better for him to just symbolically, at least, to show up and stay there for a few days. He would come in for a photo op and then fly back. He liked his creature comforts. He was an older man at this point, and he also could argue fairly that the occupation of Japan was a very complicated endeavor with many, many components, and he needed to pay attention to what was going on there. I think he became the very definition of an absentee general. And so what did he do? He put his right-hand man, someone who pretty much was a sycophant of MacArthur, in charge of the army on the ground in the 10th Corps, as they were called, in Korea. Now, General Almond was kind of the antithesis of...
and sorry, can I just stop you there? Because I didn't quite understand. Does Almond control all the armies in Korea, or does he only control some part of it? Because you've got the army in the west, which is attacking up the west coast of Korea. Is that also fundamentally under Almond's control, or is it only the Marines and so on?
Almond was in charge of something called the 10th Corps, which was kind of a made-up word. It was essentially an amalgamation of a lot of different forces, mostly almost entirely on the east side of Korea. That's a whole nother story what's going on the west side. But when I say an amalgam, I don't mean just an amalgam of American forces, but also all the UN forces that were participating, including, there were forces from Colombia, Puerto Rico, the UK especially, also Australia, New Zealand, and many other countries that had joined in on this. And also within that fighting force of the 10th Corps was the 1st Marine Division. So essentially General Smith had to look up to Almond. Almond was his boss. And they did not get along from the minute they met. Almond was dismissive of Smith. He was arrogant. He mimicked many of the personality qualities that MacArthur had. It was almost like he was a mini-me. He was General MacArthur's mini-me. And, it's kind of interesting, and it's an important part of the narrative to see how these two guys clashed. And fundamental way that they clashed is that General Smith thought that Almond was reckless with human lives, took too many risks, was all about pushing as far and as fast, as he could go, that he was not really interested in the intelligence that was coming in on the ground. And the main intelligence, of course, that everyone wanted to know what was really happening with China. Is China going to enter this war or not? Are they going to come across that Yalu River from Manchuria or not? And this was something that Almond simply just did not want to believe. And that's because MacArthur did not want to believe it. So even as they take Seoul and they keep pushing north towards Pyongyang and towards the Yalu River, intelligence begins to trickle in. Very, very good intelligence that the Chinese are crossing the Yalu south, and that there's going to be a big collision of these forces somewhere in North Korea. And when I say good intelligence, I mean sort of like skirmishes with Chinese forces that produce prisoners who are interrogated and who very freely acknowledge, yeah, we're Chinese, red Chinese. We're here, we're Mao's forces. We're here to protect the homeland from the imperialists. There's hundreds of thousands of us. And yet this is intelligence that MacArthur didn't want to believe. and Ullman didn't want to believe. And for a long time, they sublimated this intelligence. They squatted on it. And, finally, and all of this is leading towards the real subject of the book, which is the time and the place at the Chosin Reservoir where the Chinese really in full force show themselves. And it's really one of the great battles of American history, at least, and one of the great battles of world history, for all sorts of reasons. And it's really the second half of my book.
I guess one of the things I've read somewhere is that a mistake the Western forces made is that they thought China was subservient to Russia, and they had good intelligence from within Russia that Russia really didn't want to get involved, and so they assumed that China would just do as they were told, and they didn't understand that China had its own ideas. Is that something you've come across, and do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I think it's absolutely true. There was a notion that Mao's forces were, they were just a ragtag band of guerrilla troops that were held together with string and bamboo, and they didn't. It's true, they didn't have very good artillery. They didn't have an air force. They didn't have a navy. They had, just recently won the civil war in China, and certainly had shown themselves to be resourceful fighters. But they didn't have any of the components that we associate with a modern motorized army. And so they weren't a threat. MacArthur said, he could defend against them with one arm tied behind his back.
Right, so they're not going to come, and if they do come, it doesn't matter, right?
And it's the classic thing of asymmetrical warfare, too, I think, that we later saw in Vietnam, which is, yes, they are not a modern mechanized army, but they have other strengths. They can move. They don't need to worry about roads, for example. They can move overland, over mountains. They can preserve the element of surprise. They can, of course, the other factor that Mao had going for him is huge numbers, just huge numbers of soldiers that he was willing to commit to this cause, and he didn't seem to care about casualties. He would just throw more of his own men into this battle. But it's also true, as you said, that we were focused more on the Soviet Union and Stalin. What was Stalin going to do? Was he going to enter the war? And there was this perception, later turned out to be an erroneous one, that Mao was completely subservient to Stalin, would do whatever Stalin said. But Mao really wanted to be taken seriously as a world leader, and that this was truly his sphere of influence, not Stalin's. China had a long and ancient relationship with Korea and had its own ideas about how this conflict should go. So in many ways, this was Mao's first attempt to assert his persona and his leadership and the leadership of this new China, just won this civil war, on the world stage, and to sort of flex his muscles and say, this is what I want, this is what I think. And what he wanted and what he thought was slightly different in many respects from what Stalin wanted. So yeah, I think you were right. That was probably an intelligence failure, a strategic intelligence failure on the part of the United States, that we didn't perceive that, although Russia and China had many areas of similarity, there were also many areas of difference.
And I guess we didn't appreciate, or the Americans didn't appreciate, just how annoyed the Chinese were that Formosa, now Taiwan, the Americans had blocked the Red Chinese from coming across and taking it off Chiang Kai-shek. When the Chinese forces decided to go up and over through Manchuria, across the Yalu into North Korea, they had been training in tropical gear for an amphibious landing, an amphibious invasion of Taiwan, of Formosa. So they were focused on that, and the U.S. sent the 7th Fleet to protect Formosa. And so instead of going south, Mao sent his troops north. And one of the things that's kind of tragic is most of them were not prepared with basic gear for the cold weather that they would be experiencing in North Korea. They were thinking
Taiwan, it's warm. We'll have warm gear. Most of these guys didn't have socks, for example.
That's one of the biggest characters of your book is the weather.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah,
let's get on to that in a minute, but let's just move Smith's men there, because they go rather slowly by sea, mm-hmm. but they get up to a port quite far in the north. I'm probably going to get the name wrong, but I have it written down here as Hungnam. Is
yes.
that right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so they disembark in Hungnam, and then from there if I get the geography right, from there the Marines push up into the mountains heading north towards the Yalu River, and sort of halfway between Hungnam and the Yalu River in the mountains is this thing called the Chosin Reservoir.
Yes, and it's it was a reservoir that was constructed by the Japanese during their occupation of Korea as a hydroelectric concern to fuel the development of Japan's war and munitions factories down on the coast. It was an alpine lake, essentially, man-made, that by this point had completely frozen solid. It was just a sheet of ice. And this was one of the places that the Chinese were very interested in, because in addition to providing power for parts of North Korea, that hydroelectric plant provided some electricity that fed into networks of Manchuria, China. So they made it pretty clear early on that this and several other of these reservoirs in the mountains of North Korea were assets that they would protect. Again, we didn't really pay attention to these signals. We just, and Ned Allman kept urging the Marines, just go as fast as you can, keep going, get to the Yalu. If you can get to the Yalu, we will have united this whole country, and North and South will be one country. The war will be over, and we can go home by Christmas. It'll be quick and it'll be easy. Unfortunately, the weather was starting to intervene. The roads were icy. There was only one main road that went up through this part of the mountains, and the Marines began to realize this is perfect ambush country. This is the kind of place where every hairpin turn could be another extremely dangerous place, and it's like all of their training had taught them to be very much avoid this kind of situation where you have a long convoy of your troops on a dangerous road like that. So the Chinese had begun to filter down, and we have to give the Chinese a lot of credit for how they were able to elude the intelligence for so long. I mean, they were masters at this sort of thing. They had learned this during the Civil War in China. They traveled at night, only at night. They hid during the day. They lived off the land. They didn't have any vehicles that could be spotted from the air. They hung out in the mountains and down in these hollows during the daytime, and covered themselves with sheets, white sheets, so they couldn't be seen. They just blended in with the snow, and were working their way towards this reservoir with great stealth. Even though some of them had been caught and interrogated, most of them had finally gotten themselves into positions around the lake, around the reservoir.
So is it worth just trying? It's quite difficult. In your book, there's a map setting it all out, but is it worth just trying to set out where the Americans get to before the Chinese finally intervene decisively? Because I think there's about 3 or 4 positions which the Americans have I think you make the point very well that Smith is a cautious commander, and so he moves his troops to a place and makes sure it's been properly supplied and fortified before sort of moving too far further on.
Mm-hmm. General Smith kind of crept up right to the line of insubordination. He was being told, move as quickly as you can to the Yalu, but he was saying, well, I'm going to tap the brakes a little bit here. I'm going to try to figure out where this battle is most likely going to happen. because by this point he knew the Chinese were there. And so as he got up to the reservoir, he decided that he needed to create a fortress, essentially, in the mountains, on the lake, on the shores of that lake, that would be his stronghold for the battle that he saw coming, that his superiors didn't believe would ever happen. And so his forces got to a series of villages. There's one called Udemni, which was really the farthest north that he got, and a series of other villages just along the southern shores of the lake. But he decided to sort of have a headquarters and a stronghold. He thought that also there would be casualties, like any battle would have casualties. How do we get the casualties out? Well, we need to build an airfield. And almost overnight, they get the engineers up there with their bulldozers and backhoes and grading equipment and scrape off the ice and build an airstrip that would be long enough to service fairly large planes to bring supplies in and to bring casualties out. He did all of these things, by the way, and he did them almost with against the orders of his superiors. This is one of the many reasons why General Smith is revered by the U.S. Marines as a savior, for having truly saved a lot of lives and foreseen, almost like he was clairvoyant or something. It's like believing in his own intelligence. He was seeing what was about to happen. The Chinese were all around. There were reports everywhere. Every village had intelligence that the Chinese were up in the mountains somewhere. They'd been heard. The deer were coming down the mountains out of fear. Clearly something was up there. They were spooked.
But you said you said a few minutes ago that they were masters of guerrilla warfare, but this isn't a guerrilla army, is it? This is a vast number of people.
At this point, yes, it's a huge number of forces. It's probably 250,000 in the immediate Chosin Reservoir area, but they are sprinkled around all over the place in different pockets on both the west side and the east side of the Chosin Reservoir.
And how many American troops are there up at Chosin at this stage? I think there's something like 8,000. I think I picked up at the northernmost point.
Yes, I think that's probably the number of Marines that are there. There's also an American-led force of Army guys that are on the east side of the reservoir, which is really kind of considered almost a different battle. I refer to it many times. I go into it a few places, but it's east of Chosin is another battle which is devastating. The Americans are nearly wiped out by the Chinese there. But it's wrinkled country. It's very wrinkled country. It's very hard to get from one place to the next. Many parts of the battlefield are essentially like separated by topography from other places. Except for air power, there's really no way to kind of get from one place to the next. So it becomes a very complicated battlescape.
But in places, the Chinese, they outnumber the American forces they're attacking by just an astonishing number.
Something like 10-1 in places. And, that's one of the factors of this battle, is that the Chinese have a numerical superiority. And they also have the element of surprise. But the Americans have the better firepower, by far, and the better equipment. No one was prepared adequately for the cold that descended upon the Chosin Reservoir. But the Americans at least had, socks and gloves and good parkas. The Chinese, many of them literally did not have socks and gloves, and they were wearing little tennis shoes, little sneakers.
Dear God.
It was just astonishing that Mao sent them into battle with such paltry equipment. But the thing that is beginning to happen is the weather becomes almost like the third combatant in this battle. As the weather slows everybody down, it gets to 30 below zero. Artillery won't fire correctly. Guns, rifles won't fire correctly. Helicopters won't fly. in the old days, when armies confronted weather like this, they would eventually just shake hands, say, declare a ceasefire and say, look, we'll see you in the spring and go their separate ways. But that didn't happen here. They just kept going. So people, unfortunately, begin to, literally to freeze to death in large numbers, and hypothermia. And it affects the way they think and, their ability to make good decisions. And so I do try to make it in the book a character, as you say. And then the other kind of contributing factor with the weather is the topography, because they're fighting in these very steep mountains, in this very remote wilderness. Sometimes they're fighting literally on the frozen shores of this lake. And it's a very weird, surreal kind of environment to imagine fighting in. And then there's the fact that the Chinese only attacked at nighttime. So these battles are happening in the glare of these phosphorus flares and moonlight against the white snow. It's just a very spooky and unusual battle. Just simply the atmospherics of the battle.
And the Chinese, when they attacked, they loved to signal that they were coming with bugles, which must have just added to the surreal nature of the scene.
Yeah, so the Chinese army, they didn't have radios, and they communicated by different kinds of signals, like cymbals and bugles and drums and shepherd's horns, even from hillside to hillside, to convey information like, we're going to charge now, or we're going to back up and regroup. When this first happened, the Marines were completely freaked out by this. They didn't know. It sounded like some kind of witches party or something in the mountains stirring in the distance. Later, as they got used to it, the Marines decided they liked this, because it always gave them a little bit of a heads up that a charge was coming. As they heard this din of all this racket up in the mountains, then they realized, oh, here they come. The reason they fought at night, only at night, the Chinese did, was because they were terrified of American air superiority. The United States and the Allied forces, the UN forces, had complete control of the sky during the day, unless there was a major snow system going through that hurt their visibility. Otherwise, they were in complete control. They were coming on from bases along the coast, these planes, or from aircraft carriers that were out in the sea. And then, as soon as night descended, the Chinese felt they could come out safely and fight, and they did. And they would come in. They came sort of in these waves. After the bugles and after the cymbals and the drums, they would appear in one wave. The first wave would be armed. And this is the other factor I wanted to mention, is that Chinese, many of the soldiers did not have weapons.
Dear God.
They did not have weapons. The idea was the first wave charges, and many of them will drop, will be killed. And the second wave comes and picks up the weapons of the first wave and keeps moving forward. And so forth, then a third wave and a fourth wave. And these waves would just happen all night long. And Mao's generals simply didn't seem to care that they were being used as cannon fodder, that they would just get mowed down. And that's another factor in the battle, is that so many of these battles were fought with a screen, essentially, in front of the Marines of dead Chinese who quickly froze into these weird contortions, and they ended up using the Chinese corpses as almost like sandbags, as part of their perimeter. So again, I mean, there's just so many ghastly and rather grotesque elements to this battle, and many of those waves that I mentioned finally did reach the Americans, and a really large percentage of the fighting was done close in, like hand-to-hand combat, with shovels and pickaxes and entrenching tools, and the butts of rifles and bayonets, So it becomes like this really very old school kind of fighting that you associate more with like medieval times. And, the one thing that the Americans do say about the Chinese is that they were inordinately brave. They kept coming despite all the odds against them.
Not just brave, but incredibly skillful to be able to get such a large number of troops into position like that just to get the logistics. And although you say that, parts of them didn't have weapons and so on, nonetheless, the scale of the achievement is really something.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, you could argue they do win the battle.
Yes. My book is essentially a book about an American retreat. The Chinese technically won the battle. When I say technically, what I mean is they ejected their enemy from the battlefield.
Yeah.
Now, they did so with casualties that we would consider obscene and untenable. We being, I guess, the UN forces, but certainly the American Marines would have considered it to be obscene and untenable. And it is a retreat. The Marines hate to use the word retreat. And I've learned that there are many euphemisms for retreat, like, advance to the rear. That's one I like. Retrograde maneuver. But the reason this battle is so widely celebrated within the Marine Corps and a lot of military historians is that a successfully orchestrated fighting withdrawal is considered the most difficult maneuver there is in military science. It's one thing to fight when you're dug in. It's another to fight when you're moving backwards.
Yeah.
And that's what they did. They fought their way out of this trap at this reservoir. Down that same little narrow serpentine road that they came up on, they had to go back to the coast where they could reorganize and live to fight another day. And that's what they did.
And you can contrast that with what happens in the western side of Korea, where the army effectively disintegrates, and that doesn't happen to the Marines at all.
No, on the west side, that's a whole other story. They disintegrated, as you say, and literally just ran for their lives. And with the exception of a few units in a few places, there was very little contact with the enemy. They just turned and ran. So the Marines did pull this off and view this as a victory of a sort because they were on the verge of being annihilated. But the Chinese, as you say, were the victors in this battle. And I think it's worth mentioning that recently the Chinese film industry, in combination with the Chinese government, put out this enormously successful film.
It's called the Battle of Lake Changjin.
Changjin is the Chinese word, the word they use to describe the Chosin Reservoir. Same battle, same lake. And it's just considered the most successful Chinese film of possibly of all time. It's an enormous hit over there, and in part it's to celebrate the achievement, as you say, of what the Chinese pulled off in this battle. But it's also it's a bit of a propaganda film. It was practically written by the government, and it doesn't even acknowledge other points of view at all. But
I looked it up in Wikipedia when I found out about it, and I think they mention it. Doesn't even mention the invasion by the North of the South.
Yeah.
I just wanted to come back to something, because you say they have this fighting retreat, and one of the most, to me at least, remarkable stories is the story of the bridge, because in their retreat there's a bridge, a huge bridge that is blown up and pretty much destroyed. And that's it. They're pretty much cut off now, and they're stuck. I just thought that the solution to that problem was so American. I don't think it's something that the British could pull off. Certainly we don't. We just don't have the equipment, or we certainly didn't at that time. So do you just want to tell the story of the bridge?
General Smith was worried as he moved his forces up to the reservoir that there were a couple of choke points, a couple of places where, and especially this one particular bridge, that if it was blown, they would essentially be trapped up there forever, with no way of getting out, because there's only one road up. And just, they passed that bridge, and They got up to the reservoir, and the Chinese, when they encircled them, they did just exactly what General Smith worried about, which was they blew this bridge up. And so when the Americans are pulling out, they come to this bridge, and it's just a chasm. The engineers are scratching their heads, trying to figure out how to get them out. And they decide to get these girders, these enormous girders, from down along the coast, and fly them up and drop them inside a perimeter. This has never been tried before. These are enormous girders that are essentially prefab structures. But when they drop them from these airplanes, some of the girders are badly mangled and are useless. But they get just enough girders, I think 5 of them. And then they have to figure out, how to get those girders to the bridge, because the bridge is heavily guarded by the Chinese. So the engineers do get the girders there. A battle is happening. In the middle of a battle, these engineers are swinging out over this chasm, fastening these girders together. It was a seat of the pants, completely improvised, 11th hour kind of series of moves that got this bridge built. They're riveting, and as they're like hanging out over this chasm, swinging out over the precipice, and they get the thing built, and the convoy rolls across it as quickly as they can possibly get across it. And then as soon as they make it to the other side, the engineers blow up the bridge so that the Chinese can't use it. So it's just kind of one of these desperate moves that that is typical of this whole battle. There's things like that are going on throughout the story.
But the sheer ingenuity of it and the shortness of time that they have to carry it out, it's just a remarkable story, actually.
Yeah. Well, I think that the unsung heroes of many battles are the engineers, and that's certainly true of Chosin Reservoir. The guys who built that airstrip almost overnight so that the casualties could come out, for example, and so many other places up and down the battlefield, and just making the equipment work in 35 below zero weather. And the engineers are the stars, really, in many parts of this saga.
And you mentioned air power, because that was tremendously important. The Chinese had terrible problems moving in day, and regardless, even when they weren't moving, they could be, the planes could cause them terrible trouble. But there was this really strange story that you had about the pilot Jesse Brown and his wingman Tom Hudner, and just want to tell that story and maybe just explain to me how that could possibly have come to be. It seemed like the most extraordinary development. Yeah,
that story is a legend within the Battle of Chosin Reservoir. It's a Navy story, not a Marine story. But there were these corsairs that were flying off of an aircraft carrier into the battlefield, and to engage the Chinese forces. And one day, this pilot, Jesse Brown, was basically shot down over the battlefield. His gas line was punctured, or his oil line was punctured, and he crash landed onto a hillside in a few miles from the reservoir. And his wingman, who you mentioned, Tom Hudner, looked down and saw what was happening. He circled the crash site several times and saw that Jesse Brown was still alive, and he was waving. And however, that his plane was on fire. It seemed apparent that Brown could not get out of his plane. He was somehow trapped. So Hudner circled a few more times, and then he made a fateful decision, a decision that went against all Navy protocol, which was he decided to crash his own plane into that same hillside and try to save his buddy. I say it's against Navy protocol because these are expensive planes, and this is an active battlefield situation, and the protocol was no heroics to save your comrade in this situation. Just carry on with the fight in other ways.
But not just that. I mean, there was no real place to safely put your plane down. You were going down into, well, as you say, sort of into a mountainside. I guess there must have been some level ground to some extent, but this was not some, nice, easy sort of farmer's field, right?
Right, and the odds are very good that he was going to crash his own plane and get killed in the process, not save his buddy, and even or get captured by the Chinese, who are everywhere in this part of the battlefield. So, but he did it anyway, and he thought he'd be court-martialed for doing it. Tom Hudner, but he got out of his plane, although he was injured, and went over to Jesse's plane and got different tools, an axe and a pickaxe and a crowbar and all anything he could try to do to get his buddy out of there. But he was wedged in there, and he couldn't get Jesse out. A helicopter showed up a little later, or he rather called for a helicopter. And the helicopter showed up, and then so now there's several people trying to get Jesse out of there. But they are unsuccessful. Darkness is descending, and it's freezing cold. Plane is still on fire, but they were able eventually to put the flames out. Hudner wanted to be there with Jesse until the end, and Jesse's pulse was fading, and then eventually he died on the battlefield right there in front of his buddy. Hudner left by helicopter, went back to the base, assuming he was going to be court-martialed for doing this. And in the end, he was awarded the Medal of Honor by President Truman for the bravery, for his attempt to save Jesse Brown. It's a story that is being turned into a movie right now, a major feature film. You'll be hearing more about that story in years to come.
But I guess Jesse is famous as well in military history because he's the first. Is he the first black pilot in the U.S. Navy, or is it in the Air Force generally? It must be in the U.S. Navy.
The first African American pilot in the Navy, and the first one to fly off these aircraft carriers. He was on the cover of Life magazine. He was considered a pioneer in race relations at the time, and Jesse and Tom Hudner were just really close buddies who had trained together for years all over the United States, had been on tour together in the Mediterranean. So their friendship was was a beautiful thing and a rare thing in American culture at that time. Tom Hudner became very good friends with Jesse's widow afterwards, and I got to interview Hudner shortly before he died. It was very interesting to get to know him, and no regrets for what he did. He except his only regret was that he was never, in the end, able to save Jesse.
Okay, well, I guess we're sort of getting towards the end. So the Americans do manage to escape down the mountain. The Chinese either don't want to or can't follow them at this stage. So do you just want to finish off either by explaining what the Americans do next, or just give us a very quick summary of where the war goes next? Or I'm in your hands.
Well, the Marines and all of the 10th Corps do make it down to Hamhung, Hungnam, these twin cities down near the coast, where they establish a huge perimeter and are, at that time, General Smith thought that they would perhaps stay the winter there, and keep trying to defend that place because they thought they could hold out for a long time. But already the powers that be had begun to organize a massive evacuation of all the troops there, and not only of all the troops, but even many, many thousands of civilians, North Korean civilians, who had become refugees. And this evacuation is like on the order of Dunkirk. It's a huge number of people. Hundreds of thousands of people are successfully brought out of there and brought down to the south, where the troops reorganize and re-enter the war. The civilians, meanwhile, repatriate to the south, and they say today that over 1 million people in South Korea owe their lives, and sort of trace their family roots back to that evacuation that took place right around Christmas of 1950. The war rages on for 2 more years. It gets to be a very complicated story. Suffice it to say that it ends where it all began, more or less at the 38th parallel, where the Chinese and the Russians in the north and the UN forces in the south are fighting over little bits of terrain as they get closer and closer and closer and closer finally to that original line, the 38th parallel. And I think this is one of the reasons why this Korean War is such a complicated thing to sort of deconstruct, and even those who fought in it, it's hard. There was no victor exactly. We died for a tie, they say. It was a stalemate, and not only that, but there was not even a true treaty at the end of the war. There was just an armistice, which left a lot of things unresolved, and that's one of the reasons why the DMZ is such a scary place. It's essentially a place where war could reignite at any time. It's one of the most tense borders in the world, if not the most. For all those reasons, it's a very complicated war to understand. Some people say it was a world war that was fought in a very tight little piece of geography. It was certainly the opening salvo of the Cold War, when the Cold War became very, very hot for about 3 years in this one cursed place. And of course, like all wars, it's the civilians on both sides who suffered the most. Just a devastating war. And the North Koreans were bombed back to the Stone Ages. And certainly all of this contributed to the mentality, their mentality and their hatred of the United States. It was kind of gratuitous bombing. It was just unbelievable. It was a bit like the firebombing of Tokyo and cities that happened during World War II. But it's a war that could reignite at any time, and it's certainly a place that is one of the hot spots in the world that everyone has to kind of keep an eye on.
And yet, South Korea today, South Korea then, or Korea then, was poorer than most African countries, and now today, I don't know where South Korea sits in sort of the table of wealth, but it's right there at the very top of the developed world. It's quite an astonishing story. So I don't think I think the Americans should be thanked for something at least.
Well, I think it's the 11th largest economy in the world. And I went back to South Korea with a bunch of veterans who had fought there. And they remembered Seoul and other cities in South Korea as, bombed out, just utterly destroyed places. And what they mainly remember was, all these little villages, these peasant villages. They were starving. They were it was a agrarian society, and it was just so poor and forlorn. And then they come back to Seoul, this giant megalopolis that is just booming right now. And we took one of these bullet trains down to Busan, this high-speed train, and it was just this modern technological society, a democracy, and considered part of the family of modern democracies. And they were very proud. They're like, we didn't really see this coming. And maybe in the end, even though many of them had doubts and bits of skepticism about why they participated in this battle and this war, they came away from that trip thinking, yeah, maybe we did a good thing. Maybe we fended off. We let this fledgling democracy take wing and fended off this country from a kind of uniquely malevolent, as it turned out, dynasty. The Kim dynasty is super weird and super oppressive and authoritarian, and seems like each generation gets a little bit weirder and to the present day.
Let's leave it there. So Hampton, thank you so much for today. I really, really enjoyed that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it as well.
Well, that's the end of today's podcast. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, then I have a big favour to ask. I don't look to make any money from the podcast. There's no advertising or anything like that. I just do this because I enjoy speaking to the guests, and I'm keen for them to get as big a audience as possible because I think they are really, really good people. So if you could share it on whatever social media channel you use, tweet it out, whatever it is, and even better if you could leave a review on iTunes, that would be absolutely fantastic. Anyway, goodbye for now.